Joe Kissell takes control of Mac Basics. This is Mac Voices. Today's Mac Voices is supported by MacVoices After Dark. What happens before the show starts and after we sign off? Informative, fun, and completely off-script conversations. That's what. MacVoices After Dark is an exclusive benefit for our Patreon subscribers. Sign up now at patreon.com/MacVoices. Welcome to Mac Voices. This is the talk of the Apple community, and I'm Chuck Joyner. Folks, we get to have Mr. Joe Kissell back with us this time. He's going to tell us about a take control book that's not exactly a take control book, if that makes sense. I'll let Joe explain. Joe, it's good to see you.
Always nice to be here, Chuck. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, first time in 2025, and we're starting out with a brand new book authored by you.
Yeah. So this book is called Mac Basics. I'll let you guess what it might be about. Most of our titles start with the words take control of, but not all of them. We have several that for one reason or another, we decided to title differently. This is one of them. We used to have a book called Take Control of Mac Basics that was written by Tanya Engst, who is our former editor-in-chief. It was a great book, but when Adam and Tanya sold Take Control to me back in 2017, Tanya went off and got a full-time job. And so she was no longer able to keep that book updated. It was last updated back in the days of Mojave, 2017. And it went farther and farther out of date. And eventually we had to discontinue it because it just didn't even approximately match up with reality. Meanwhile, I've been getting so many people writing to me and even calling me on the phone saying, I need a book that covers the fundamentals. And we just didn't have anything like that in our catalog. So I wrote it. Brand new from scratch book that covers some of the same, a lot of the same stuff that Tanya's old book did, but this was a fresh start. It is considerably longer than Tanya's book was. And it's my attempt to say, okay, whether you have just unpackaged your very first Mac ever, or whether you've been using a Mac for 10 years, but you've always felt this kind of discomfort that you didn't really know what you were doing, I'm going to give you all the fundamentals, everything you need to understand what is on your Mac and where and how to do things all in one terrific little package. So that's what this book is, Mac Basics.
So a couple things occurred to me when you were telling me about this book. The first is that, we still hear a great deal about switchers. And switchers may be, are probably coming over from another platform if technically they really are switchers. And they may have some idea of some of the graphical interface metaphors, but at the very least, it's going to be a passing familiarity. More importantly, they probably don't know how they're referenced in the Mac OS. So, and I can't think of a good example, but what might be, well, we know the Finder, but they may know it as something else.
Yeah.
And so they're looking for an application called Finder.
Right.
And that's a challenge. But the other thing too is that you're right. There has not been a really good baseline solid reference for some of this stuff. And those of us that have been doing it for a while, we know it. But when you sit down and try to talk to someone who hasn't, you realize just what a challenge it is to get down to that basic level. So I'm really curious as to how you approach that so that you didn't overlook things.
It was surprisingly challenging. By the way, I want to remind you, come back to the switching thing later on because I have some things to say specifically about that. As I was writing this book, I realized that every topic I would address presupposed knowledge of some other topic. For example, I would say something like, you can go to the file menu and choose print or press Command P. But then I was like, no, wait a minute. I haven't explained what the Command key is yet or how keyboard shortcuts work. So like everything I would say required you to already know something else. I would say, well, in the Finder, you create a new folder, and wait a minute, what is the Finder? Where is the Finder? How do I create a new folder? So, of course, we use the technology available to us. We use cross references. So if I mention a topic that I haven't actually described yet, what is a pop-up window? I say, see, what is a pop-up window? And you click that link and you go to that place. So a lot of people are going to have to do some jumping around if and when they encounter terms that they're not familiar with. I did my best to start at the highest possible level and work my way in. I talk about you have a Mac in front of you. What are the components? There's going to be a display of some kind. There's going to be a keyboard. There's going to be a mouse or a trackpad. But what else? What are all these funny keys on the keyboard? What's that thing with the round dot on it next to the F12 key? Oh, that's a Touch ID sensor. Wait a minute, my keyboard doesn't have one of those. Why not? So, all the different things that you will physically see on a Mac, the ports on the side or on the back. Does your Mac have a power button? Some of them don't exactly. All those things. So I start with like, what are you physically looking at? And then I say, okay, now we're just going to focus on the screen. And what do you see on the screen? Well, at the top, there's a menu bar. What's a menu bar? How does that work? What are on the various menus? What are these little funny icons over off here to the right, of which I have, like on this particular Mac, I'm not even going to take the time to count them. I'm going to say there's maybe 30. Like, what are those things? And what's the dock, and how does the dock work? So I kind of go from the hardware to the screen, what all is on there, and then I talk about the Finder. What is the Finder? Where is it? How does it work? What is it for? Why do we call it the Finder as opposed to just Finder? We don't call it the Mail or the Safari or whatever. It's just, but there's a whole story about that. So I put that in there. So as I go, I'm not only trying to make sure that you know what all the things are, what they do, how to use them, but also why we use certain language to talk about things. And this is relevant to switchers, but it's relevant to everybody else too. I get people emailing me or calling me trying to explain some problem they're having. And I really want to help them, but I can't see what they are seeing on their screen, and they don't know the names of things. They can't say, well, it's on the popover that appears when I click the share icon, because they don't know that the share icon is called the share icon, and they don't know that a popover is called a popover. So they're making up names for things that are not the actual names for things, and because those aren't the words that I would use or other tech support people would use, it's really, really hard to help them. So I'm trying to explain what things are called and what they do, as well as all the rest. So boy, it was a real challenge. And I thought I was super careful. I thought I was super careful. Like, now remember, Joe, the first time you mention any particular term, you have to either define it or give a link to where it's discussed later. But sure enough, my editor was several different times. She was like, this is the first mention of this thing, and we don't know what this thing is. I missed one. I missed another one. So I had to go fix those things. So it was surprisingly challenging, but it was, I felt that as a person who in theory knows all this stuff, it was educational for me because I got to understand at a kind of deeper level all those interrelationships between things. And I had to make explicit things that I kind of knew, but I wouldn't have been able to articulate them until I was forced to spell things out. So I think that really, even for moderately experienced Mac users, this is going to be a helpful tool.
Boy, there are a lot of questions I want to ask, but
hey, it's your show. Ask
this book
questions.
Yeah, right. This has to have a massive amount of links back and
Oh
forth.
yeah.
I can only imagine what that's like. And also a massive amount of screenshots, because everything you just said, I'm sitting here thinking, oh yeah, I didn't. Of course, I know how the dock works, but somebody else may not. Um, this may be dangerous because I don't want to send you down a rat hole of having to do more work. Did you include a glossary, or do you let the hyperlinks speak for
No,
themselves?
there's no glossary. I between the definitions I provide as I go and the links, I feel like everything is covered. We experimented a long time ago with glossaries and take control books, and they were a huge amount of effort, and almost nobody ever read them. Whether you're reading the PDF version or the EPUB version, you can always search for a term, and we figure that between the links and table of contents and the quick start and the searching, it's pretty easy to find any term.
And I hadn't thought about that, but you're right. Since this is not a paper book where you would have to try to figure out where to find something, you can just do a search and, look for the very first entry, and that will either give it to you or give you a hyperlink to where you can find it. So that makes a lot of sense. So where do you draw the line? When do you stop trying to explain everything? What is no longer a Mac Basic?
Boy, I struggled with this every day when I was writing the book, and my editor struggled with it, and we struggled together because I expected this book. I set out to write a 150-page book. Like, how much can really be said about basics? And it's nearly 200 pages, and on in every single topic, I was like, yeah, but I could say more about this. And I'm thinking, yes, you can do it this way, but did you also know that there are 5 other ways to do this thing? Or, there's this really cool tip that I could give here, which would make things so much easier. And sometimes I included a bit of extra information, but most of the time I had to say, but that's not really basic. It's not really basic. It's important. It's useful. It's interesting. But if I want to include all those cool things, then it's going to be a 400-page book, not a 200-page book. And nobody wants to sit and read 400 pages of this kind of stuff. So a lot of it was just kind of, I have to figure it out as I go along and kind of say, well, does this feel too advanced? Does this feel like it's a basic thing or not? And I can't say I have a really strict algorithm to determine what's in and what's out, but I am quite explicit right in the beginning of the book and saying, if you are an experienced Mac user, you're going to be reading this book and you're going to go, oh, why didn't he also mention this? Why didn't he also mention that? I know another thing that this can do, or another way to do this activity. I'm like, this is not a comprehensive book about literally everything your Mac can possibly do. I'm trying to not overwhelm or frustrate people who are just getting started. So there are some scattered tips and some very slightly more advanced things and tons of stuff I wished I could have included, but I wanted to somehow keep it manageable. And as long as I'm talking about this, I should mention another thing. I had to draw the line at which Macs and which operating systems I would discuss. We have some books that are like, well, if you're running, Mavericks through Catalina, do this. If you're running this through this, do it this way. If you're running this through this, do it this way. Only in Sequoia and later, you do things this way. And all those different variations are just, they make a book a lot longer. They make it much, much, much harder to read. And it's a slog for both the author and the reader. So I would like to be able to say, oh, any Mac you have, it's from 20 years ago, doesn't matter. Of course, this book will tell you how to use it, but I can't do that because then again, the book would have been so much longer and so much harder to read. So I decided, for the sake of everyone's mental health, that I was going to draw the line at Ventura. Now, Ventura is already a few years old. And so I basically say, if your Mac is already running Ventura or Sonoma or Sequoia, great, you're all set. Everything here is what you need to know. If you have an older Mac that is compatible with Ventura or later, it's still running, Monterey, but you could install Ventura or Sonoma or Sequoia. First thing you need to do, click this link to where I talk about upgrading your software. Go there, install a newer version of Mac OS, and then we'll be on the same page, literally and figuratively. So the you have to be this tall to ride kind of line is Ventura or later. That doesn't mean that you can't use the book if you have an older version of Mac OS, but I explain at the outset, these are the Macs that are able to run Ventura or later. And if you have one of these, and by the way, here's how to find out what version of Mac OS you're currently running, because that's not going to be obvious. By the way, what even is Mac OS? So again, all the like links to links, but I had to draw the line both at the end in terms of how complex I get, and at the beginning in terms of what range of Macs and operating systems can I reasonably talk about.
I really like the fact that you talked about the physical part of a Mac as well as just the OS, because honestly, that's not something that I would have even thought about as we started the conversation. But USB ports and USB-C ports and HDMI ports, and we all know what those are without even thinking about it. But somebody that is brand new to this, pardon me, may not.
Well, you mentioned USB ports, and we have, Glenn Fleischman wrote this incredible book called Take Control of Untangling Connections, about all the many, many different varieties of USB and USB-C and Thunderbolt and DisplayPort and HDMI and like all these different things that you might have on your computer, the different cables. And, this cable, the plug fit in that socket, but the thing doesn't work. Why not? And so it's really quite involved. And so Glenn has this whole book about that. But again, this is not that. This is a book on basics. But even so, a very new, not necessarily sophisticated user is still going to want to plug something into their Mac. They're going to want to plug in a keyboard or a mouse or a camera or something. And so I needed to explain, okay, what is the difference between USB-C and Thunderbolt? Because there is a difference, and it's an important difference, but the plugs look the same. So stuff like that, I felt obligated to spell out.
Right. So how deep do you go into the applications, I guess? And I want to be real careful here, because when I say applications, I don't necessarily mean Keynote or Mail, but I'm thinking more about all the other ancillary options that you have that only affect things you do on the Mac. If that makes sense, it does in my head, but I'm not sure I'm articulating it properly.
Okay, I don't know if I fully understand the question, but I will say something, and if that didn't scratch your itch, then you can tell me. I'm looking at this chapter in my book called Use Your Mac's Built-in Apps. Now, I have a whole chapter about working with apps, like what is an app? How do I open it? How do I quit it? Can I have lots of apps running at once? How do I find new apps? Do I have to download them from Apple? An app isn't working. How do I make it quit? Like all those different things. How do I do the basic kinds of things that people need to do with any app, wherever it may come from? But then I have this rather long chapter on all of the apps that come with your Mac. And I'm just looking at the manuscript right now, and I thought I might have counted them up and mentioned that number someplace, and I didn't. So I'm not going to count them because holy cow, there are a lot of them. There are so many apps that come with your Mac. And so I wanted to have a chapter that at least mentions every single one of those apps, including all those apps tucked away in your utilities folder inside the applications folder. And in most cases, it's just half a page or something, a few paragraphs that tell you what this app is, what it's for. There are a few that I go into more detail about because they're much more important and people will be spending a lot more time in them. Safari is a great example of that. And some apps that I kind of say, it exists, whatever. It's a chess game, you know. So, but I do want to make sure that I at least give you something so that if you see this app there and you decide to open it, you won't be completely lost. Well, what is the purpose of, Photo Booth? What is that? What's that for? Why do I have an app called Stickies on my Mac? Still? Really? In 2025? Yes, you have an app called Stickies. You don't need to use it, but you could use it. What does it do? And all these utilities like, Activity Monitor, Bluetooth File Exchange, really? Feedback Assistant, really? Grapher? What do we need a grapher for? Okay, so there's a 5-line paragraph about this little utility called Grapher. It's not a big deal, but somebody has to tell you what it's there for. So I talk about apps at a higher level, like what is an app? How do you do basic things in any generic app? And then I run through all of the apps that Apple includes. Of course, I also talk about various ways of adding apps. But if that didn't answer your question, I will be happy to say more about it.
No, that's exactly, you were, I couldn't pull any out of my head, but you came up with exactly some of the examples. Something as simple as text edit or Stickies, that can be useful for someone if they have the need or the desire to use them, as opposed to something like even Notes, because Notes is becoming a whole lot more than just a little notepad. Absolutely. Like it once was. So again, there's that. You had to face the challenge of trying to draw that line and saying, okay, this is what it is, but there's so much more here. Or in the case of text edit, this is what it is, and that's about it.
Yeah. So, yeah. A point that I didn't make in the book, but I'll make it now, is that when Apple figures out how to do a certain thing, they like to put that thing everywhere. So you take the iWork apps, the Pages, Numbers, Keynote. If you go into Pages, which is a word processor, you can make a table. Okay, fine. But that table can have basically complete spreadsheet capabilities built into it because Apple already created Numbers, it's a spreadsheet, so it's tables plus a lot of other stuff. And Apple was like, well, we already have that code. It works. Let's just stick that in Pages too. In fact, it's even in Keynote as well. Keynote has all these like drawing and graphics tools. Well, almost all of those are in Numbers and Pages as well. And so Notes, ostensibly this little, note-taking app with nothing else in it. Well, Apple came up with all these ways of doing certain things with styled text and tables and lists and things that had been developed for other apps, and it was sort of like, well, hey, let's stick that in Notes too, and all of a sudden Notes becomes this much bigger thing. So there's a real tendency to have some feature, some set of features that was developed for a particular purpose over time kind of spread out throughout Mac OS, which is great because once you have learned how to do a thing in one place, now you know how to do it in lots of places. it's not 100%. Like, you can't literally do every single thing that numbers can do inside Pages or Keynote, and you can't certainly do everything. All of the text editing features from Pages do not exist in TextEdit, and all of the text editing features from TextEdit do not exist in Notes, but they all do a lot of borrowing. So you can think of this as feature bloat, or you can think of this as Apple doing a nice thing for everybody.
Boy, that's really interesting, because feature bloat drives me crazy in some apps, but on the other hand, others it doesn't, I guess, because maybe those are things that I would actually use in that app. So one man's desired feature is another man's feature bloat.
Yeah.
Me too. Joe is back next time to finish up our conversation of Mac basics. And in case you haven't figured it out yet, shade 321. Joe is back next time to finish up our conversation about his new book, Take Control of Mac Basics. And in case you haven't figured it out, this book isn't just for basic users or switchers or that category of user. It's a little bit for everyone, because you've been using things for a long time. You may have missed a few things. You may not know what they're called. So there are a lot of reasons that you're going to want to pay attention to the next part of the interview with Joe and Joe's book. Until the next time, and as always, thanks for watching.